folks, it is 7 o'clock, so we're going to get started. I want to say a few thank yous. I want to thank Brian Dorrington from Tewksbury Telemedia for live streaming tonight's event on YouTube. I just checked now and we had over 30 people, so that's great. What are we at now, Brian? 54. Okay, there we go. So I want to thank everyone who's watching at home, and especially those that are in the room. I want to thank Debbie and Dan, the owners of the Book Oasis in Stoneham, for giving us a little bit of a discount. We did a bulk purchase, and we have lots of copies of Mr. Martin's book for sale afterwards, and we're even going to give some of them away. Okay, we're feeling extra generous. And speaking of feeling extra generous, we also have some cupcakes, okay, from Josie's Bakery in Wilmington on the back table, so feel free to indulge after the program. I also want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the Corning Foundation for co-sponsoring tonight's event. And I feel like I'm forgetting something, but it'll come to me. For those who are in the room, when we get to Q&A, I'm going to have to hand you the microphone, okay? So the folks at home can hear you, okay? Restroom down the hall on the right. If anyone has any cell phones on them, please turn those to vibrate or silent. And why don't we jump right into it here? So I'm going to introduce Mr. Martin. This is a thrill. Mr. Martin spoke here maybe 7 or 8 years ago. He was excellent, and we're so glad to have him back. So William Martin is the New York Times best-selling author of 12 novels, an award-winning PBS documentary on the life of George Washington, and a cult classic horror film, too. In novels like Back Bay, City of Dreams, The Lost Constitution, The Lincoln Letter, and Bound for easy for me to say, Bound for Gold, Mr. Martin has told stories of the great and anonymous of American history, and he's taken readers from the deck of the Mayflower to 9/11. His work has earned him many accolades and honors, including the 2005 New England Book Award, the 2015 Samuel Eliot Morrison Award, and the 2019 Robert B. Parker Award. He and his wife live near Boston, where he serves on several cultural and historical institutions boards, and he has 3 grown children. So all 50 plus of us watching at home, and let's say 20. They can't see the audience. The 20 of us here in person, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mr. Martin.
Thank you. And are we getting feedback here?
It might have been me.
It was probably that, yeah. Okay, good. Thank you, and good evening to all of you who are here and all of you who are listening on the YouTube. It's a pleasure to be in Tewksbury again. And yes, it was 7 or 8 years ago, and yes, I was excellent. Let's hope I live up to my past performances here tonight. I'm talking today about December 41, my new novel set in World War II. And like all novels that I write, like all novels that every author writes, it has its own special process of coming into being. There is an idea, and you need to find that idea before you can get work. Is this okay? Am I? Okay. All right. Every novel is born of a different experience, a different idea. For example, Back Bay, my first novel, which, by the way, just yesterday on Boston.com, they did a survey of readers to pick the 46, I don't know why they chose 46, but to pick the 46 best books set in Massachusetts ever. And Back Bay is on the list. So is Cape Cod. I'm on a pretty good list with Robert B. Parker and Dennis Lehane and Louisa May Alcott, among others. So it is a good list. But Back Bay was born of a 4th grade geography class, Robert Gould Shaw School in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. Miss Houghton describing for us the way in which the city of Boston evolved from that narrow peninsula, the Shawmut Peninsula, cut down all the hills and dumped the hills into the tide flats and land and created landfill. And she described the filling of the Back Bay and told us that, you know, you could today dig down through the landfill, and if you dig in the right place in the basement of some fancy building on Commonwealth Avenue or Marlborough Street, you might dig down into an old trash dump from the 19th century where the things they threw out then, pottery, silverware, things like that, would be treasures to us today. And I remember when I was in the 4th grade thinking to myself, what if there was real buried treasure down there under the city of Boston? And 20 years later, when the wolf was at the door and no Hollywood producer wanted to produce the screenplays that I was writing, I dusted off that idea and wrote Back Bay about the lost Paul Revere tea set that may or may not have sunk into the mud of the Back Bay. You'll have to read the book to find out. And that book, of course, spent 14 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. That is what I call a real buried fossil, something that gets layered into your brain way back when, and it's finally emerges at a time when you almost don't even expect it. Another way to get a good novel going is the bolt of lightning. You're driving along and all of a sudden it hits, or you see something and it hits. I saw, driving along with my wife one day, a bumper sticker. The bumper sticker said, "Bequeath thy kidneys." I said to my wife, what if somebody got an organ transplant, became fascinated by the donor, fascinated by the donor's life, got involved with the donor's family, and found himself at the end of the book in the same situation that the donor had actually been in at the beginning of the book? That book became Nerve Endings, a thriller that I wrote that came out in 1984, and that you can still get on Kindle or as an audiobook. Then, of course, there is the good first line. You're in trouble as a writer. You're sitting there saying, I don't have any ideas. What am I going to do? How am I going to get this next book started? Let me start writing down good first lines. This was actually the experience of Joseph Heller. After he had the enormous success with Catch-22, he couldn't come up with another book, so he started writing down first lines, and the first line that he wrote was, "Something happened." And that became the novel, Something Happened. I never read it, but I remember asking my father-in-law, "Did you read that?" And he said, "Yes, I did." I said, "What did you think of it?" He said, "Nothing happened." But I wrote down, well, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, sounded too familiar to me. So I tried the opening line of Catholic confession, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," which prompts the response, "How long has it been since your last confession?" I have two characters now, a priest and a penitent. The penitent says 6 weeks and 3 days. And the priest almost falls out of the confessional because that's a signal. The guy on the other side of the confessional screen has come to Boston in 1916 to collect the money that the priest has been raising to support the Irish Rebellion. It became the novel The Rising of the Moon, which came out in 1987. For December 41, I was at the movies. My wife and I were watching the movie that you've probably all seen called Darkest Hours, with Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill. And there is a scene in that movie where Churchill goes downstairs into the basement of his headquarters to get on the secure phone and call Franklin Roosevelt and beg him for help, because it's May of 1940. France is falling. The German army is closing in on the British at Dunkirk. all seems lost unless the English can get some help from their American cousins. And FDR says to Churchill, I cannot help you. All I can do is give you my good wishes because American politics ties my hands. And the camera cuts back to a long shot, and we see Churchill slumped in despair in the darkness of his basement compound. And as I looked at that image of Churchill, I thought to myself, in a year and a half, right after Pearl Harbor, Winston Churchill will get to Washington, D.C. at Christmas, and he will stand with Roosevelt on the south portico of the White House on Christmas Eve to light the national Christmas tree. And then he will give a remarkable speech about the unity of our two nations in their crusade against fascism. The two of them will be there. And what a target they will make. And there was the book right away before the movie was over. And I liked the movie, but I was thinking up this novel in which a German assassin is going to be dispatched to kill Franklin Roosevelt on Christmas Eve when he lights the national Christmas tree. That's the big overarching plot of December 41. It begins on December 8th, 1941. Why did I choose to begin on December 8th? Well, for a lot of reasons, but it is one of the most earth-shaking world historical days in human history. Consider, as I did when I started thinking about this novel, and as I wrote, consider the whole world at war. Imagine yourself as there was starts traveling west over the international date line, out in the far Pacific, the line that divides yesterday from today. It is 2 a.m. on December 8th, 1941, as the drone descends down into Tokyo, where we see the Japanese foreign minister going to the emperor, presenting to the emperor in the middle of the night a sheet of paper, telling the emperor that this sheet of paper in 30 minutes will be submitted to the American Secretary of State in Washington. It tells the American Secretary of State that diplomatic relations are now suspended between the United States and Japan. In 90 minutes, the bombs will start falling in Hawaii. The emperor approves. Our camera picks up again and travels west, out across the vast and empty canvas of Asian Russia. It picks up steam trains heading west toward Moscow, where the great cataclysmic battle between the Russians and the Germans is being fought. It passes over Moscow and passes over the German lines, which have reached to within 12 miles of Moscow in the month of December 1941. It continues to travel over the battlefront, over the piney woods of East Prussia, down into the dank, poured concrete, depressing, cold, damp headquarters of Adolf Hitler, the Western Front headquarters called the Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair. On the night of December 7th, Adolf Hitler's in a bad mood in the Wolfschanz. Of course, you could probably think that Adolf Hitler was usually in a bad mood. And on that particular night, he was in a bad mood because the Russians had counterattacked up and down the Eastern Front, and they had driven the Germans back for the first time. For the first time, his army is in trouble. They don't have the proper winter clothing. They don't have the proper support that they need, and the Russians are finally showing some backbone after 6 months of being defeated. Hitler is in a lousy mood, and then he gets word of Pearl Harbor, and he exults. He says, now we cannot be defeated, now we cannot lose, because we have an ally in Japan who has not lost a war in 3,000 years. Adolf Hitler could even then demonstrate a wonderful capacity for self-delusion that would only grow greater and greater as the war went on. The next morning, on the morning of December 8th, Adolf Hitler makes for the train station because he's headed back to Berlin, because he now has a plan to declare war on the United States before the United States declares war on him. It's a foolhardy plan, but he will follow through on it. The camera picks up again and travels across subjugated Europe and comes down into England, into the Prime Minister's weekend retreat at Chequers, where Winston Churchill, on the night of December 7th, is holding forth at the dinner table when the butler comes up to him and whispers in his ear. Immediately, Churchill leaps up, runs up the stairs to a secure line, and calls Washington. He says to Franklin Roosevelt, "Mr. President, what's all this I've just heard about Pearl Harbor?" To which Roosevelt responds, "It's quite true, Winston. We're all in the same boat now." And Winston Churchill, as he will write in his 8-volume history of World War II, Winston Churchill says that he went to sleep that night contemplating the limitless resources and military power of the United States. And he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful, because England would survive. The next morning, he gets on the train and heads to London to declare war on Japan. Our camera picks up and travels over the roiling gray Atlantic, coming into the United States over Bar Harbor, the first place in North America to see the sunlight in the month of December. And it heads down toward Washington, D.C. It spins down into the dense fog and mist that covered the city on the morning of December 8th, 1941. It descends into the central hallway of the White House, the family quarters. It picks up with Butler Alonzo Field, who is walking along carrying the president's clothing for the day. When Franklin Roosevelt has chosen that day to wear diplomatic clothes, striped trousers, swallow-tailed coat. He brings them into the president's room, where the president, in my imagination anyway, is sitting up making the final edits to his speech. We know he did that morning in bed before he even got up. And I like to imagine that he has just made what is the most famous edit in the history of American rhetoric. He has just run a line through the words "in world history" and replaced them with the words "in infamy." He actually had originally written that speech to say "in world history." That edit will resonate down to us right here tonight. So he finishes the speech. Alonzo Field takes him into the bathroom, then brings him back to bed, and now they begin the process of dressing. Franklin Roosevelt, as we all know, had polio, had lost the use of his left legs, or both legs, had lost all muscle below the waist, but he never appeared before an audience until the very end of his life. He never appeared before an audience except on his feet. In order to achieve that, he would lay out full on the bed, and Alonzo Field would put on the stainless steel leg braces that extended from the heel to the above the knee. They were hinged at the knee so that he could sit comfortably, and then when he stood, they could be locked. They were attached with straps at the thighs, a belt at the waist, and putting them on was agony. Walking with them, to the extent that Franklin Roosevelt could walk, using a strong arm on one side and a cane on the other, until he got to a podium that he could grasp and stand and give his speech from. Walking with them, moving with them was agony as well, but he understood the importance of appearing upright, in front of an audience. So he gets dressed. They take him down to his car, put him into the car at 11:30 a.m. that morning. Now, there is a kind of urban myth that I think may be true, that the car that he rode in that day was actually Al Capone's limousine. The reason for this was that they had orders in Detroit to complete 2 armored limousines for the president, which he would eventually ride around in, but those limousines had not been completed yet, and here was a moment when the president needed to be in an armored car, if ever he needed to be in one, because the atmosphere in Washington on December 8, 1941 was very tense. One primary source, one reporter writes that there has been no atmosphere like this in Washington, D.C. since Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address in 1861. There are 3 Secret Service men on each side of the vehicle as the president starts down Pennsylvania Avenue. None of them are wearing overcoats, even though it's cold and gloomy, because, of course, if they have to go into action, and they believed that they might have to go into action that day, they had no idea of who could be in that crowd that lined Pennsylvania Avenue. If they had to go into action, they wanted to be able to move quickly and without the encumbrances of the top coat. The crowd was quiet. Military officers and soldiers lined Pennsylvania Avenue every 5 feet. Every manhole cover had been welded shut. There was no incident. FDR made it up to the Capitol and into his private little entrance under the Capitol, where he was taken out of the car, put into his wheelchair, wheeled to the office of the Speaker of the House, and that is where the novel begins. It was the largest radio audience in history. On the cold coast of Maine, they were listening. Down on Wall Street, trading stopped so they could listen. On assembly lines in Detroit, they were taking long lunches so the auto workers could listen. In Chicago, the butchers stopped slaughtering in the stockyards to listen. In Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, where they grew corn and wheat enough to feed the world, now that the rains had returned and the dust had stopped blowing, the farmers were listening there too. In all the places where the muscle and sinew of America bound one state or town or family to another, they were listening for the warm baritone and patrician inflections that somehow never sounded too upper crusty coming out of the radio. Because America had awakened that morning to the cold reality of war. War in every time zone. War encircling the earth. War once more as the original human fact. In Hawaii, U.S. Navy battleships burned beneath great funerary clouds of black oil smoke. In the far Pacific, Japanese troops attacked along every line of latitude and longitude. In swirling blizzards of blood and snow, Russians and Germans slaughtered each other before Moscow. Across Europe, jackboots echoed and resistance guttered, while U-boats stalked freighters on the roiling gray Atlantic. But Americans were listening because Franklin Roosevelt was about to make sense of it all. In Washington, the CBS radio announcer was describing the packed House chamber, the tense atmosphere, when suddenly his voice rose. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the president is appearing and moving toward the podium. And from out of deep bass console, a roar exploded. Something between a cheer and an angry shout. The harsh, hard, ferocious cry of Americans lifting themselves from shock and drawing strength from the president, who'd lifted himself from a wheelchair and by remarkable force of will was appearing upright before them. When the roar receded, the speaker announced, "Senators and representatives, I have the distinguished honor of presenting the President of the United States." More cheers and shouts. Then Franklin Roosevelt's voice rang out, firm, confident, indignant. "Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. In the West, radio stations had gone off the air the night before so that Japanese bombers couldn't home in on the broadcasts. But now Roosevelt's voice rolled across deserts, up and over mountain ranges, and down into the warm green dream of Southern California, down along boulevards laid like gridwork atop lettuce fields and orange groves, down onto long, straight, relentless thoroughfares that ended where scrub-covered hillsides leapt up to define and divide the expanse of Los Angeles, down into offices and coffee shops and cars where people were listening, unaware that as Roosevelt spoke, a Nazi assassin was shooting at targets in a local canyon and planning the most daring act of the age, unaware also that before it was over, he would draw many of them into his dark orbit. I guarantee you, if you read that opening, you'll read the next page, and then I'll have you. You'll be hooked. There are a lot of reasons why I open on December 8th, and a lot of reasons why that camera tracks down into Los Angeles, because Los Angeles is going to be the main location at the beginning of the book. I read years ago about a place in Los Angeles, a creepy place that you can still visit. If you drive out Sunset Boulevard, out into the very expensive Pacific Palisades neighborhood, right opposite the Riviera Country Club, you take a right and you drive up one of those hills, up past movie star mansions and so forth, to the top of the hill, and you go around the side of that hill onto a fire road, and suddenly the land turns wild in front of you. And down in the canyon, opposite the Riviera Country Club, there is a compound, the ruins of a compound that still exists, which the pro-fascists purchased, or they purchased the land from the Will Rogers estate in 1933. Will Rogers had no idea what they were up to, but this compound of poured concrete, a power station, fuel tank, water tank, roads, terraced gardens, and a 40-room mansion that they never built, but which they planned to build, the plans of which you can still find at the UCLA archives, a mansion that it was believed was being built as Hitler's Western White House. This compound became a kind of a mecca for neo-fascists of the Silver Shirt League, the Ku Klux Klan, the German-American Bund. All of them became visitors to this area where they could drill, practice street fighting tactics, do things like that. And I read about this place, and I said, someday I'm going to write a book that begins in that place in Los Angeles. Because, of course, Los Angeles was a very significant hotbed of neo-fascist activity during the 30s. A lot of reasons for that. One of them being that the FBI worried about the Germans in New York, but they didn't worry too much about them in Los Angeles. Even though every freighter that came from Germany around to Los Angeles and docked at Long Beach would have aboard a Gestapo agent who was bringing cash to support German activities on the West Coast, and anti-Semitic literature, and orders from Berlin. So there was a very strong German presence, and I thought I have to write a book about this, especially since we know that the FBI on December 8th fanned out across Los Angeles, first to arrest Japanese nationals, and then to arrest Germans, They arrested 265 Japanese that day and about 50 Germans. And a lot of them they arrested in that canyon. And it's a very creepy place, as I said. They arrested Germans down there, except for the one German they should have grabbed that they didn't. My fictional character, the assassin who has to get himself to Washington, D.C. in order to shoot the president on Christmas Eve. He didn't like the Bund too much, but he liked their money because the money allowed him to maintain multiple identities and maintain multiple locations in which to live. But this Bund, this German-American Bund, operated in the wide open. First of all, the FBI in Los Angeles didn't care too much about Nazis. They were worried about communists. You've all read The Grapes of Wrath. You know what great fear there was in Southern California about communists during this period. The other part of it is that the Los Angeles Police Department was pretty much, well, they didn't mind looking the other way because they were pretty sympathetic to the Nazis at that point, up until Hitler declared war. The only group that was watching the German-American Bund was a group called the Los Angeles Jewish Community Committee, which had been organized by a Jewish war veteran by the name of Leon Lewis. And he had gathered various Gentiles, friends of their organization, friends of the Jewish community in Los Angeles, who had helped infiltrate the Bund. And they had learned of some of the plans and some of the tactics that the Bund was developing in the run-up to the war. For example, the Bund leaders had hatched a plan that would have used United States military veterans from World War I who were still in the National Guard to take weapons out of all of the armories up and down the West Coast, put them in secure places like that canyon down there, and use them on Der Tag. Der Tag was the day that all of these neo-fascist groups were looking toward, the day when they and all their allies would rise up in the United States, start shooting all the people they didn't like, and take over control of all of the state governments across America. This was happening in the 1930s, and it was envisioned by these people. That didn't come to fruition. Neither did the plan to kidnap, all on one day, Harry Cohn, Louis B. Mayer, Jackal Warner, Samuel Goldwyn, all the Jewish movie executives. Kidnap them, take them up to a place called Hindenburg Park, and hang them. That was seriously discussed. And of course, they might not have been successful with those plans, but one plan that did work out for them on a regular basis, they would send agents into Hollywood, and along Hollywood Boulevard, they would go up onto the tops of buildings and throw down anti-Semitic literature. They called it snowstorming. Pour all of this literature down onto the streets of Los Angeles. Their Bund Hall, by the way, was at Figueroa and 14th, the site of the Staples Center today. You can't see this Bund Hall. It basically is at mid-court of where the Lakers play. But if you could go back in a time machine, and this is your time machine, if you could go back in a time machine to 1941, you could very easily walk into the Bund Hall. In the foyer, you could look around, and to your left was the Aryan bookstore, where you could purchase cookbooks, German literature, and all the anti-Semitic material you wanted. To the other side was the Gaststube, where you could order beer, Wiener Schnitzel, Sauerbraten, all those wonderful German foods, and admire a map with pushpins showing the movement of the Wehrmacht across Russia in that year of 1941. And directly ahead of you was the auditorium where they gathered for parties with the Umpah bands, and every April they celebrated Adolf Hitler's birthday with swastikas and pictures of the Fuhrer and marches and parades, all in uniforms that looked like brown shirt uniforms. These people were dangerous. They were bonkers, but they were dangerous. And they were a real concern to a lot of people in Southern California until the FBI started arresting them as the war began. And out of that community emerges my antagonist, my anti-hero, the German assassin. And his adventure begins on December 8th. But there are a lot of other reasons why I chose December 8th. One of them is that not only is it a day of amazing significance in world history, the day that the United States enters the war, it is also a day of enormous cultural importance in the United States, because it's on that day that the mail arrives from New York, the mail bag that has been sent out from New York containing the books, plays, manuscripts that the Warner Brothers story editor has collected out there that she wants reported at the studio. And in the mail bag is a play. The play is called Everybody Comes to Rick's. Anybody know what that play will eventually become? Casablanca. That's right. On December 8th, the first day of our involvement in the war, that play gets assigned to a young reader. Back then, as it is today, if you want to get a job in Hollywood, you start off as a reader. It's at the lowest rung of the totem pole, even though you are the first filter for all of the material that is headed to Los Angeles, to the studios. And the character who got it, he was a real guy by the name of Stephen Carnot, working for $1.12 an hour. He read the play in a couple of days, wrote his report, submitted it on December 11th. He wrote, as his lead-in, excellent melodrama, colorful, tense mood, will make an excellent movie. He then disappears from the history of entertainment. He went back into some other industry in the war, and I thought to myself, well, he disappeared, but I'm going to give all of that job to one of my characters. You'll meet that character in Warner Brothers on that day, December 8th, as he gets the play Everybody Comes to Rick's. And I don't try to parallel Casablanca in any way in the book, except for the fact that there is a love triangle in my book, but it gets dispensed with very early. However, there is a larger thematic element in my book that is expressed in a way in Casablanca as well when you see it. In the scene where Bogey is sitting there after that first encounter with Ilsa, the club is now closed. He's at a table. He's drinking bourbon. Sam is in the background tinkling at the piano. And Sam says, or Bogey says, Sam, it's December 7th, 1941 in Casablanca. What time is it in New York? And Sam says, I don't know, sir. My watch has stopped. And Bogey says, I bet they're asleep in America. I bet they're New York. I bet they're asleep all over America. And out of that idea, of course, in the story, you see Bogart is going to rise and wake up himself to a lot of realities that he has to face. And in my novel, we meet a lot of characters who are trying to make it in Hollywood in one way or another, or doing whatever they can to make it back east. And all of them in some way are products of American popular culture at the time, and all of them are going to awaken to these new and heightened responsibilities as American citizens as they confront the reality of that German assassin, and it will fall to them ultimately to try to stop him. The book is steeped in the history of Hollywood and of American popular culture at the time. That's why it's in black and white. The cover is in black and white, because the movie that I'm playing in your head should play in black and white. It's film noir in Los Angeles at the beginning. Then it's a train ride, classic 1930s train ride. And then it's the Hitchcockian climax on the south lawn of the White House. All of those things play into it. And when they get to the south lawn of the White House, and they do get there, the assassin does make it to Washington, D.C., because you can't write a novel with this on the cover, the Zeiss 39 scope aimed at the south portico, exactly as the assassin will see it in the book, in the book itself. You can't write a book like that and not have that climax take place. So I'm not giving anything away when I tell you that on the Tuesday, December 22nd, 2 days before the climax, the German assassin is sitting in the Hay Adams Hotel directly across Lafayette Square from the White House. He opens the newspaper and sees on the cover of the paper a picture of Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt standing together the night before on the front lawn of the White House. And the headline is, "Churchill in unity talks with FDR at White House. The German assassin says, 'My God, I can get them both. I can end the war in a single night.'" Because he didn't know until that moment, just as German intelligence did not know until that moment, just as nobody knew until that moment, that Winston Churchill, on the morning of December 8th, immediately began working on FDR, saying, "I have to come and see you, Mr. President. We have to start making plans. We have to do it face to face." FDR held him off for a little while, but finally relented. Churchill immediately planned a trip. He got aboard a battleship, the HMS Duke of York, and for 10 days steamed across the stormy North Atlantic, through the German U-boat stream, out into the middle of the Atlantic. He called it the worst 10 days of the war so far. He wrote that to his wife. One of his aides fell and broke an arm, and all of them got seasick, except for him. He was constantly dosing himself with Mother Sill's seasick remedy, and watching movies and reading C.S. Forester novels all the way across the Atlantic, staying in contact with the government back in London, which they could receive radio messages, but they could not transmit because they didn't want to give the Germans any indication of where he was. Destroyers would come close every day, and they would signal by light to the destroyers anything that the Prime Minister wanted to send back to London. Then the destroyers at night would drop back by 100 miles and transmit. Finally, Churchill gets to the Chesapeake, the mouth of the Chesapeake. The plan is for him to steam up the Chesapeake and arrive in Washington on Tuesday morning. But he says, "I have to get there immediately. I have to get there Monday night." So they put him on an airplane. And Tommy Thompson, his bodyguard, Lord Moran, his doctor, and Lord Beaverbrook, his political aide, are in a plane as it starts up the Chesapeake Bay. And Churchill writes about this, so does Lord Moran. The experience that night, it was around 5 o'clock, about an hour's flight from Norfolk to the Anacostia Naval Air Station in Washington. They are looking out the windows, and they are looking out on something that they have not seen in 2 years. They are looking out on lights, automobiles, street lamps, things like that. And they all comment on it. Churchill turns to Tommy Thompson and says, "What do you see?" And he says, "I see more than lights. I see freedom." And that's what they felt when they got here and realized in a tangible way, the power of the ally that they were about to have. The plane landed. FDR was there to greet them in the limo, take them to the White House, where Churchill and FDR would stay in conference for 2 weeks. Eleanor Roosevelt would go bonkers with Winston Churchill. with his drinking, with his demands. The morning after he arrived, after they'd had their first dinner, he called Alonzo Field into his bedroom, which was right opposite the Lincoln bedroom, and said, "No, we had a wonderful dinner last night, didn't we?" "Yes, sir. And we want to leave here as friends when we go, do we not?" "Well, yes, sir. So I have a few requirements. I require that there be no talking outside my door. I require that there be no whistling in the hallways. I hate whistling. I also require at breakfast," and he gave his menu with the various foods, "and of course, a tumbler of sherry and a glass of wine." That was his breakfast. "And it shall be delivered every morning at 11 a.m. with the newspapers." He slept late. He worked very late and slept late. That was a problem with Eleanor because Franklin tried to stay up with him and keep going, even though Franklin was an early riser. And of course, could not keep up with Churchill, who could drink anybody under the table. So they worked together for 2 weeks, and on that December 24th, 1941, Christmas Eve, they appeared on that south portico together. And as you read that scene, when you come to it, you will be experiencing it just as those people experienced it, because I researched it completely through radio broadcasts and newspapers and every other way that I could. And the most significant bit of historical footage that I saw in the writing of this book, and one of the most amazing bits of footage that I've ever seen, is a Pathé newsreel film of the speeches of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill from that podium. The camera is right here. They are totally oblivious to it. Somebody set it up and turned it on, and the camera runs for 35 minutes. Franklin Roosevelt begins and says, "And now for the 9th time, I light the living community Christmas tree of the United States." And he throws a little switch, and you hear bong, bong, bong as the bells across Washington begin to ring. Then Churchill steps up and gives a remarkable speech, the climax of which is, "So we will let the children have their night of fun and laughter, and tomorrow we will get back to the business of saving democracy and saving the world." And it's a spectacular speech that he never would have gotten to give if that Nazi had pulled that trigger. And when you get there, when my characters are trying to stop that guy in the climax of December 41, I guarantee you'll be saying, "Oh man, I hope they get him. I hope he doesn't pull the trigger." Because if he kills Churchill and Roosevelt, we're in really bad trouble. And that's what I'm supposed to be able to do, is to make you feel, even though you know it never happened, to make you feel, because you are so invested with the fictional characters and their fates, to make you feel like it might happen, it could have happened. Let me just turn the page and see what does happen. And I think you will enjoy this book and my trip back to 1941. And thank you all for listening, both here and at home.
Let's give Mr. Martin a big round of applause. And so we're going to take roughly 10 to 15 minutes of audience questions. And I do remember what I forgot to mention at the start. If you're watching from home, YouTube comments are disabled. So you're going to want to email me. Just respond to the email I sent you this afternoon with the YouTube link. But first, we're going to take care of the people in the room. They are my priority. So is there anyone in the room here that has a question for Mr. Martin? All right, well, I'll ask, you touched on it briefly at the very end, but can you talk a little bit more about the research that went into this book? Specifically, and did you learn anything surprising about FDR, Churchill, and their relationship?
Well, the research was, like all books, you begin doing research that is a mile wide, an inch deep. You read some generalized texts. Then you start boring holes where you can down into the more specific bits of information into the newspapers of the time, or in this case, into the radio broadcasts of the time. For example, the description that I read to you at the beginning of the book about Roosevelt with the CBS radio announcer describing the pact, that all comes right off of the National Archives site that provides radio transmissions that were recorded on that day. At the end of the book, you'll hear, as I did, and as you can hear if you go on to the right sites, the broadcasts of that night. And now we interrupt. What was the show called? I can't remember. And now we interrupt the Goldbergs, brought to you by Does Detergent, for the special broadcast. There were actual soap operas, they called them, because they were advertised by Does Detergent and people like that. And that's how the name soap opera came, because they were advertised like that, and they all ran at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, except at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you had the president and the prime minister about to give these remarkable speeches. So there was lots of radio, lots of video. If you go on my website, williammartinbooks.com, the very first thing that I have on the website is a timeline, a historical timeline that I put together of December 41, based on YouTube videos of the war front, the home front, and of course that amazing speech that I've just described for you. Other things that I did, and that I always love to do, I always love to walk the ground when I do research. I know Los Angeles extremely well because I lived there for 4.5 years, and my son lives there now. And so, and that's another rule that I've developed. Try to write books about places where your kids live. The book that I wrote about Lincoln and Civil War Washington fit nicely into the fact that my daughter was living in Washington at the time. The last book that I wrote, which was called Bound for Gold, about the California Gold Rush, worked nicely because my oldest son and his family live in Berkeley, and it's very easy to jump off from Berkeley up into the gold country whenever you go to California. And now I have a son in Los Angeles, and we had a great time going to that German compound, the ruins of which you can still explore. And it's never quite sure if you're not supposed to trespass there or if it's okay. Lots of graffiti, lots of ghosts, lots of creepiness. We also ate in Musso and Frank's a couple of times, the famous Los Angeles restaurant on Hollywood Boulevard, which has an early scene, of course, in which my characters are looking around, and there's Bogart and his wife having an argument. They were called the Battling Bogarts. Later, the main character, just before he heads east and heads into deeper and deeper trouble, is sitting in Musso and Frank's, and he hears a familiar drawl behind him. He turns around and he sees John Wayne. He hears as well a woman speaking in a German accent. And he isn't quite sure, but he thinks that it is Marlene Dietrich. Because believe it or not, John Wayne and Marlene Dietrich were an item in 1941. A little known and hard to believe fact, I suspect. But one of the best pieces of research we did, best pieces of on-site research, was the middle of the book takes place aboard the Santa Fe Super Chief, which leaves from Los Angeles and travels to Chicago. Now, I didn't particularly want to ride Amtrak from Los Angeles to Chicago, so we didn't do it. Amtrak is not quite the Grand Hotel on Wheels, which is what they called the Super Chief. However, my wife and I found that in the famous Railroad Museum in Sacramento, another trip to see our kids out there, in the famous Sacramento Railroad Museum, they have the complete dining car of the Santa Fe Super Chief that my characters travel on. And I tell you, when I walked onto that car and looked at every place setting, just as I described it. I pulled out my camera and I started taking pictures everywhere. It was like being in a scene from my book. And so research takes you from the most specific kinds of details that you read about, whether online or in books, a lot of ballistic stuff, a lot of gun discussions, which are very important because of the long range of the shot that this guy's going to try to take and so forth. From all of that into the real fun of eating in Musso and Frank's and saying, I'm right back in Hollywood in 1933.
So, Mr. Martin, a couple of online questions for you. Linda asks, there were assassination attempts on Hitler. Were there any credible attempts on FDR or Churchill?
I don't think so. In the war, they were very well protected. There was talk. The Germans hatched a plan to get at the three of them in Tehran, I think, but it never really developed. There's a book about it that I read, but that plot never developed. 1933, he had not yet been elected. He was president-elect. He had not yet been inaugurated. And he was in Miami, and he was just getting off of a train. He was getting into an open limo. There was a crowd around, including the mayor of Chicago, Anton Cermak. He reached forward to shake Cermak's hand, and there was a disgruntled character, I can't remember what really drove him, out in the crowd with a .32 caliber revolver about 50 yards away. He fired 5 shots at the two of them. Fortunately, a woman right next to the guy saw what he was doing and knocked his arm away before any of the shots hit the president. However, Cermak was struck, fell into the limo. They rushed him to the hospital with FDR cradling him along the way and trying to encourage him, but Anton Cermak would die of his wounds. Roosevelt remained unharmed. Now, as far as the idea of an assassin trying to kill FDR, one of the first things I did, and this is research I neglected to mention, was to go to the best primary source I could about this kind of concern. A book called Riley of the White House. Mike Riley, senior Secret Service agent in the White House from December 8th through the end of the war. FDR's elbow man, as he was called. The man who would stand right beside the president at all times. Because if something went wrong, this guy had to be quick and strong and sweep the president up and run with him, because of course FDR couldn't run. And Riley said that while the U.S. Army was worried about a paramilitary attack, so they put guards around the White House and machine guns on the White House roof, the Secret Service was worried about the single assassin or the small team that was dispatched to shoot the president, and that is exactly what I used in the book. When I read that, I said, okay, it didn't happen, but it could have, and they were very worried about it, and that gave me the freedom to write this book and feel as if I was, if not historically accurate, at least running in a parallel to history that would be believable.
All right, 2 more online questions. First is from Helen, and I think this is probably a short one for you. Please tell Mr. Martin how much I enjoyed this talk. And my question, any coverage of the Roosevelt and Churchill speech by William Shirer, S-H-I-R-E-R. He was a famed CBS broadcast radio journalist. Did you come across Mr. Shirer in your research?
No, well, he of course wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, because he was in Germany during most of that run-up. I'm not sure if he was, I think he was out of Germany and back in the U.S. by the time of December 24th, 1941, but I did not run across anything from him. No real descriptions of this event with him.
And we're going to get you out of here with a perfect segue, a great softball.
Okay.
Linda wants to. Oh no, I already asked Linda's question. Oh, I messed this up. Wait a second. Okay, you're killing me. You're killing me. I'll figure out a better way to do this next time. Well, essentially, someone asked. Who, and I can't, yes, Geraldine. Geraldine asked, where is William Martin's book available? So where?
Right here on the table.
And where can the folks at home purchase your book?
Every bookstore, every independent bookstore, Barnes & Noble, or your favorite online source. All of my books are available as ebooks. Many of them remain available as nice hardcovers or trade paperbacks, and all of them are also available as audiobooks. That's 12 novels. That's 42 years of my life. If you really want to go on a long journey with me, you can start with Back Bay and end with December 41 while I come up with my next idea, which I have not quite settled on yet, but which is to answer an unasked question. But the book is available everywhere. So if you don't see it, ask for it. And thank you all for coming tonight.
All right, we've hit 8 o'clock. Let's give Mr. Barton a big round of applause.